the project is that the conventional ways of reading Nietzsche in both the Anglophone and the continental traditions are seriously misleading and inattentive to the distinction in philosophical writing that Nietzsche wants to create. This means that the most appropriate first response to reading Nietzsche should be considerably more than it is now, utter confusion. And that means that to present a paper with this hypothesis means to present a number of questions that are quite confusing, only some of which can be addressed in the space of a 50-minute, 55-minute paper. So I ask for your indulgence as I go through some of these questions, and I'm looking for help in trying to understand why Nietzsche writes the way he does, and it'll be clear what that question means as I proceed. I mean, I'm particularly frustrated because since the 1960s, in the Anglophone philosophical world, Nietzsche has become more respectable by being characterized with the conventional terms of American academic philosophy as an epistemologist, a value theorist, an ontologist, a metaphysician, a scientist, and so forth. And I believe all of these are very, very crudely mistaken misappropriations of Nietzsche, who is a much more radical philosopher than is prominent in this tradition, but it's also true in the European tradition, since much of it is, although not all of it, influenced by Heidegger's readings of Nietzsche as the last metaphysician of the West. I think that is a grotesque distortion of Nietzsche, but it's been very, very influential for people like Deleuze and Derrida and Foucault and so forth. So I am out to counter this way of reading. So it's a very close reading of some passages in Nietzsche, and as I said, that can be very, very confusing at first glance. Nietzsche's Beyond Good and Evil begins with a dizzying flurry of metaphorical and genuinely figurative language. Suppose truth is a woman. Suppose philosophers, at least the dogmatists among them, have been clumsy lovers. Philosophers always appear in masks. The opposition to Platonism and Christianity, both forms of dogmatism, has created a magnificent tension, prachtvolle Spannung, and so created a taut bow that allows humankind to shoot at the farthest goals. So we should be grateful to dogmatism for that. However, Jesuitism, at this point a completely unexplained reference, and the Enlightenment have been trying to unbend such a bow and eliminate such tension. And with the overcoming of such dogmatism, Europe is now finally able to sleep. But we, not designated except as other than either the dogmatists or their conventional opponents, we good Europeans, and to some extent free, very free spirits, have a task that opposes such sleep, the task of wakefulness. This means that we inherit the force created by this tension, although it is not apparently the same sort of tension, but still what is lacking now, the need, note of spirit. We are somehow able to maintain this tension, have the appropriate arrow, and perhaps know what goal to shoot for. This figurative language continues into section 1 on the prejudices of philosophers. We are said to be learning from the Sphinx how to pose questions. But we need to know, quote, who is it really that questions us here, quote, and we need to answer a question, quote, which of us is Oedipus? Which one is the Sphinx? Unquote. Such figurative language then recedes in the course of section 1, as Nietzsche takes up in turn various schools of thought and philosophical claims, including Epicureans, Stoics, positivists and skeptics, Kant, soul atomists, physiologists, physicists, the I think thesis, and the proponents of free and unfree will. The aim seems to be to expose all such views as, quote, the involuntary confessions of their authors, unquote, revealing psychological motivations that make quite suspicious the claim that such philosophers seek the truth as a good in itself. But the figuration returns again in the last paragraph of section 1, section 23, as Nietzsche describes the sea voyage that he wants us to join him on his ship. A voyage that will show us that psychology can once again be the true queen of the sciences. He says he means psychologists who are willing to make sacrifices, even though these sacrifices will not be sacrifices of the intellect. Sacrificio del intelletto, he says. This is a good example of both how Nietzsche will allude to a topic without explaining it. Just what sacrifices will our new psychologists have to make? And it shows how he will often insert an image and only hint at why he does so much later. For this is an explanation of the last line of the preface, and his claim there that there have been two great attempts that we just saw to unbend the tension in the bow created by opposition to Plato and Christianity, Jesuitism, and the democratic Enlightenment. Sacrificio del intelletto is finally an explanation of why he referred to Jesuits, because that is the so-called third sacrifice required of Jesuits who are trying to become Jesuits. You have to sacrifice for chastity, for poverty, and the Jesuits say, sacrificio del intelletto, you have to sacrifice your intellect, that is, ignore the claims of the intellect for the sake of faith, in the service of faith, and so obedience. Such a sacrifice, which to him also brings Pascal to mind, ironically in paragraph 229, much later, where he repeats this phrase, ironically giving Pascal's Jansenist contempt for the Jesuits. I mean, this is a perfect example of how complicated this reference is. He says in the preface, there have been attempts to unbend the tension in European spirit. One is caused by the Jesuits. He says toward the end of part one, the sacrifices that the psychologists will have to make will not be the ones the Jesuits made, the sacrificio del intelletto. He repeats that phrase when he refers to Pascal, but this is a double irony. He's associating Pascal with Pascal's greatest enemy, the Jesuits. Pascal in the Lettres Provençales has nothing but contempt for the Jesuits. So he's suggesting very subtly and very ironically that Pascal is still a Jesuit, still has accomplished the sacrificio del intelletto. And he's also claiming that the Jesuits, who are supposed to be the ones who make this sacrifice, are ironically the most intellectual and casuistical of the religious orders of Catholicism. So it's an enormously complex, ironic reference in just one unexplained phrase in the preface, Sacrificio del intelletto. In the face of all of this, just of what we've seen so far, two hypotheses seem reasonable. The book itself is said in its subtitle to be a prelude, a Vorspiel, to a philosophy of the future. And that topic reappears throughout the book. Something is calling for a new philosophy. And that need is, whatever else it is, historical. The philosophy of the present and the past, for some reason, cannot be continued. Some sort of decisive historical break has occurred. So the question is obvious. What has happened? Why do we need a new philosophy? We know that there seem to be Nietzschean answers in other texts and in the Nachlass. The death of God, the onset of nihilism, the beginning of the age of the last men. But these are not prominent in Beyond Good and Evil, and we only hear such things as, on the assumption that every philosophy was originally a long tragedy. This is an assumption Nietzsche does not make. He leaves it open. He just said, if we assume that philosophy is a long tragedy, then such a long tragedy, he says in paragraph 25, has come to an end. The book as a whole, instead of saying very much about what has happened, instead focuses on thematic issues. The main one being, we want to be, we must be now, beyond good and evil. Indeed, beyond any confidence in fixed dualisms of value. The new philosophy will be a new mode of valuation, or a new way of thinking about value. Such a philosophy will not be post-philosophical, as we now say. it will be recognizable as philosophy. Just not as naive, or as clumsy, or as dogmatic, or as prejudiced. But it will still be presented masked in a mask. And this suggests the second hypothesis. So second, if we are to respect the figurative way Nietzsche writes and raise questions in his own terms, then we have to ask such questions as, what is truth such that it could be a woman? What would non-clumsy lovers be? What is this new tension? Who is asking what questions, and what does that have to do with Oedipus and the Sphinx? Then we need to assume, at least provisionally, that this Vorspiel, prelude, is some intimation of the new philosophy to come, a philosophy the form of which is like this book, figurative, metaphorical, literary. Wagner called his overtures preludes, Vorspiele, and it's more than a little likely that Nietzsche would mean his prelude to future philosophy as such an overture, which would mean trying to give us a preview of its main themes and an overview of sorts of the whole, the way an overture in an opera does. It is part of what follows it, an element with all the same themes. This would mean that we need to understand why, in the new philosophy, there is something of philosophical significance that can only be expressed figuratively. That all the above that we've been looking at is not rhetorical clothing to be peeled away to see a naked truth. It's not at all merely ornamental. But what could it be that requires such an unusual voice? If the figuration is first of all a mask, requiring questions like those just cited, rather than direct thematic interrogation, why the mask? Beyond Good and Evil is known to philosophers for two supposed doctrines in particular, perspectivism and the will to power. Is there anything about such notions that requires such a highly figurative context, where such figuration will also include not just the metaphors we've already seen, but the relatively non-continuous paragraph style, the occasional self-interrogative interruptions, aphorisms, and the frequent dangling unanswered questions that Nietzsche poses throughout? In the first two sections, on the prejudices of philosophers and the free spirit, the theme of philosophy is returned to again and again, both the old philosophy and the new philosophy coming. Most prominently, as we've seen, philosophy will abandon its faith in strictly opposite values. Well, what would this amount to? At the end of paragraph 2, Nietzsche suggests that it might be the case that, quote, whatever gives values to those good and honorable things, he'd just been talking about truth, truthfulness, and selflessness, still quoting, has an incriminating link, a bond, or a tie to the very things that look like they're evil opposites. Perhaps they are essentially the same. And he repeats the word vielleicht, perhaps. And he notes that the philosophers of the future, whom he sees approaching, will, quote, take charge of such a dangerous perhaps, vielleicht. The perhaps here does not appear to be provisional on the way towards such philosophers being certain that the noble phenomena simply are the same as their opposite values. If that is so, what would this mean, if it's always a philosophy of the perhaps, what would this mean for his own putative claims, like the will to power? What would it mean for the modality of Nietzschean claims, always to remain perhaps? He tells us a bit more in paragraph 24, where he says that instead of oppositions, there are only, quote, degrees and multiple subtle shades of gradation, unquote. And in paragraph 42 as well, Nietzsche briefly comments on the new breed of philosophers about whom he can only guess because, quote, it's typical of them, the new philosophers, to want to remain riddles, right, in some respect, Jürgen. These philosophers möchten, have the right and perhaps, vielleicht, also the wrong, to be described as those who attempt, Versucher. Ultimately, that name is itself only an attempt, and if you will, only a temptation, Versuchung. So, the philosophers of the future will only be attempters, not succeeders. And the very attempt to categorize them as that is a Versuchung, a temptation, presumably one we ought to resist. Even that is too determinate. The whole description is itself not only a mere guess, and not only characterizes the coming philosophers as only attempters, but is itself, as a determinate description, interwoven with tentativeness and mere possibility. At the very least, this begins to build a picture in which the claim, for example, that everything that appears noble or admirable human aspiration is really nothing but the will to power, looks like a reversion to exclusive opposites, not its overcoming. So the traditional view of Nietzsche that we've discovered, that the aspirations for nobility and truth and goodness are really driven by this opposite, low motive, the will to power, is an opposition that the entire book is intended to dismantle, since we want to be beyond such fixed oppositions. The new philosophy will, Nietzsche says, realize its instinctual origins and come to see itself as what it has been, the rationalization of wishes. It will understand that it's been the involuntary confessions of its authors, revealing unacknowledged moral and immoral intentions as what it strives to satisfy. Will realize that philosophers have been actors and sycophants to the powerful and self-deceived. It'll realize all that, but it will still continue as philosophy, somehow. Throughout these characterizations, there's also repeated references to the distinctive, proper, or appropriate character of philosophical writing, or more broadly, what is needed now in writing. In paragraph 27, when he tries to explain one aspect of perspectivism, he notes that someone who lives gangastrotagati, the Sanskrit for word for as the current of the Ganges flows very swiftly, will always be misunderstood by those who live as the tortoise moves, kurmagati, or who walk like frogs, mandaikagata. Having inexplicably put the point in Sanskrit, he then remarks, "Am I doing everything I can to be hard to understand myself?" Why would he want to be hard to understand? This corresponds to his frequent affirmative mentions of esotericism, as in paragraph 30. Exoteric writing sees things, he says, from below. Esoteric writing sees things from above, implying that the distinction and its implications will not be understood in his writing by those below. He notes, quote, "There are books that have inverse values for soul and health, depending on whether they are used by the lower souls and lowlier life forces or by the higher and more powerful ones," unquote. So the very same book, if read by the lowlier types, quote, are dangerous and cause deterioration and dissolution. If the very same book is read by the higher type, quote, they are herald calls that summon the most courageous to their courage, unquote. This tells us something about perspectivism already, that it's not merely about different points of view or relativized belief or theory and epistemology, but a matter of types of soul, and about what Nietzsche conceives his books as doing, and we'll return to both issues. So we already have some indication of how Nietzsche might explain his own figurative language. It is a way of ensuring that he's not too easily understood. And it could be a way of avoiding the appearance of any new dogmatism, suggesting a tentativeness, a perhaps a mere attempt, a suggestion of gradation and not opposition, an awareness of and sensitivity to the omnipresent need for interpretation. Figurative language creates this need for interpretation, often involves irony, that is, an inability to attribute a determinate claim to an asserting author, and involves a demand on the reader different from the assessment of truth values of sentences and inferences. The figurative style is a mask, but an unusual one that announces its presence as a mask and intimates a revelation that must be actively sought by us and cannot ever be finally and decisively identified. But his most prominent characterization has already been mentioned and given a fuller hearing in paragraph 40. It was also mentioned in the preface, where Nietzsche had written that, quote, all great things, in order to inscribe eternal demands in the hearts of humanity, must first wander the earth under monstrous and terrifying masks, unquote. He doesn't explain why, but his remark might provide a clue about what he is trying to do philosophically. Inscribe such hearts, in a sense in which he too requires a mask, perhaps the monstrous and terrifying ones Nietzsche is famous for, the blonde beast, the will to power. Zuchtung, breeding. The beginning of paragraph 40 is often quoted, but its meaning in the paragraph raises questions after questions that are never addressed. The familiar passage is, everything profound, alles was tief ist, loves masks. The most profound things go so far as to hate images and likenesses, unquote. A conventional understanding of the claim would be that Nietzsche believes that most people, the common people, will not understand what someone deep would write, and so would react negatively and strongly and perhaps dangerously, so that an author must protect himself by writing in a disguised way. This is a traditional Platonic and Maimonidean justification for esotericism, a centuries-long tradition of writing in a way that will protect you from the political authorities by always giving you a way of denying you're saying anything dangerous. But that's not what the passage suggests, as we again enter in a dense tangle of images. Nietzsche asks whether the opposite, really, that is, of images and likenesses, representations that reveal rather than disguise their objects, wouldn't be the proper disguise for, and here without explanation he just says, the shame of a god. I know of no reading of Beyond Good and Evil in any language known to me that attempts to account for this claim. Why does he say, I'm writing in a figurative way because a figurative way of writing is appropriate for the shame of a god? It would take a major digression here to sort this out, but we should at least note in passing that this unexplained reference is anticipatory and not at all casual by Nietzsche. The notion of shame plays a role in several contexts in the book. For example, it runs like a thread throughout all of his controversial comments about women, as in 4 or 5 paragraphs where he discusses the shame of women. But with respect to a God's shame, the remark anticipates all the way to the penultimate paragraph in the book, number 295, where he finally explains it. That dense passage, though, is prepared for 2 aphorisms that come before it, number 65, where he says, knowledge would have little charm if there were not so much shame to be overcome in order to reach it, unquote. And most importantly, 66, where he finally tells us why he makes the reference. Quote, the tendency to let oneself be debased, robbed, lied to, and exploited could be the shame of a god among men, unquote. Shame is something to be hidden, and our shame, humans who aspire to a kind of divinity, is that prior to the realization of the death of God, we let ourselves be duped, robbed, exploited, lied to, even the best of us. In 295, complicating everything further, Nietzsche says, however, with all this established, that there is one God who is without shame. Or rather, as he always says, perhaps without shame. The God he claims he makes sacrifices to, Dionysus. This God professes his love for human beings and claims he can help them become stronger, more evil, more profound, unquote. When Nietzsche, in this paragraph, assuming the role of interlocutor at this point and presenting the issue as a dialogue, professes himself to Dionysus, startled, and repeats these 3 so-called improvements questioningly, Dionysus replies by repeating them again and adding, and more beautiful. This is one of the richest passages in the book, and it is painful not to do it more justice. But what is especially significant for our purposes is that Nietzsche says, to us now, not to Dionysus, that such a remark shows that this God lacks more than shame, and he could learn something from humans, and this because we humans are more human than Dionysus. He thereby disassociates himself from the goal suggested by Dionysus, and in a very indirect way, he objects to Dionysus's shamelessness. Or there would be something wrong, inappropriate, in exposing what Beyond Good and Evil is exposing without shame, and therefore without a figurative mask to blunt the impact of the shame, at least at the beginning. So again, an enormously gymnastic set of ironies. Why am I writing figuratively? Because that's the one mode appropriate to the shame of a god. What do I mean by shame of a god? Wait till the end of the book, and I'll tell you. First, I'll hint in 66 that it means the shame of a god in a world who had been lied to, deceived, robbed, exploited. And then in the last passage, I'll say, well, there is a God without shame. And that would seem to be even better, but it's not. There's something inhuman in not being ashamed of the prior history of human intellectual life in the West. But we have to leave it at that, unfortunately, because an entire paper would be necessary for that one point. These references to esoteric writing, to the necessity of masks, and his own comments about trying to avoid being understood will eventually lead to a passage that is one of the most detailed about philosophical writing. It's paragraph 289. The relevance of this discussion is obvious in the way it concludes. Quote, every philosophy conceals a philosophy too. Every opinion is also a hiding place. Every word is also a mask, unquote. As with everything else we have looked at, it is inconceivable that Nietzsche's own anticipation of a philosophy of the future does not take into account this fact of the endless unmasking and excavation, even of the unmasking and excavating claims. He must write under its pressure and in a way responsive to it. Everything he says about other philosophers is true of him, and everything must be written in a way that takes account of this. He must write, here the explicit reference to philosophy suggests a bit more of a way of understanding the passages we've been looking at. The paragraph's topic is a hermit's life, an Einsiedler, and there are indications that Nietzsche thinks a hermit's existence is not a fully adequate image of a philosopher. But 289 also notes that a philosopher was always a hermit first, and the remarks on writing do not seem qualified by any hermit restriction. The most important passage claims that the hermit does not believe that the philosopher, quote, has ever expressed his actual and final opinion in books. Don't people write books precisely to keep what they hide to themselves? In fact, he will doubt whether a philosopher could even have final and actual opinions. Whether for a philosopher every cave must not have an even deeper cave behind it, a more extensive, stranger, richer world above the surface, an abyss behind every ground, under every groundwork, Begründung. So he's invoking the traditional Platonic notion of the cave and suggesting that that image is actually an image of people in a lower cave. You know, in the cave, the prisoners see only shadows on the wall, and Nietzsche's now suggesting that image is itself a shadow in another cave, which is itself only a delusion of someone in another cave, and so forth. A very, very difficult thing to try to write in the light of, which is what he's trying to do. Every philosophy is thus said to be a mere foreground philosophy. Every philosophy, even the philosophy of the future. There is no way in any excavation of what lies behind some expressed opinion of finding a stopping point, bedrock, foundational. Any such stopping point is, he says, arbitrary, as if Nietzsche is applying to anyone the maxim that every philosophy, or even any unmasking of philosophy, is an involuntary confession, applying it even to himself, to the maker of that claim about confessions. This echoes an earlier passage at 41, where the image is not stopping, given the realization that any such stopping is arbitrary, but what Nietzsche says is being stuck, hängen bleiben, or rather the great value for philosophy of never being stuck, either, he says, to any person, or homeland, or in pity, in some field of study, not to be stuck in our own detachment, in our own virtues, and one assumes to one's own doctrines. Finally, in 39, when he's discussing the psychological characteristics of the philosopher, he takes care to exclude what we normally think of as philosophers. That is, he says he means philosophers in some sense other than someone who writes books, and especially so-called philosophers who put their own philosophy into books. Any such person is not a philosopher. So a connection begins to emerge between the central trait of the new philosophers, who again will be primarily new evaluators, and so-called masked writing. On the one hand, not being stuck anywhere with any doctrine, not being satisfied with any stopping point, rejecting any final ground underneath some surface, like the will to power. A philosophy of perhaps, not opposites, but shades of gradation. Philosophers who are constant attempters, the very name of which suggests a determinacy that is a temptation and should be resisted. And on the other hand, writing in figurative images that must be interpreted, for which there are innumerable interpretations in riddles. Standard esoteric judgments would not be true to the caves beneath the caves that we find ourselves in. The multiple interpretability, even of ourselves, even the interpreters, required by that realization. Whatever this means, it cannot mean adopting a stance like the one sometimes heard as a sarcastic definition of liberals, someone who cannot take his own side in an argument. Someone who sees on one hand, on the other hand, on one hand, on the other hand, on one hand, on the other hand. The kind of skeptical, pluralist, tolerant. That's not Nietzsche. And so we now have another problem. There's no lack of consonance running through what Nietzsche seems to claim to know in his work. And there are certainly what sound like claims embedded in critiques of contrary claims, even if everything said is also masked in some way. In fact, we might note at the start that the possibility of such confidence in the face of the situation of post-Kantian philosophy, of the collapse of dogmatism, the possibility of such confidence might be the whole point. Compare Bernard Williams' remarks on the issue in Ethics and the Limits of Philosophy. Quote, "One question we have to answer is how people, or enough people, can come to possess a practical confidence that, particularly granted both the need for reflection and its pervasive presence in our world, will come from strength, and not the confidence, will come from strength and not from the weakness of self-deception and dogmatism. Confidence is not the same as optimism. It could rest on what Nietzsche called the pessimism of strength," unquote. The specific question that has arisen is a version of this problem, something like the modality of Nietzsche's claims, if the claiming is to be consistent with everything Nietzsche has said about philosophical assertions, especially in 289. Quote, "In fact, he, the hermit, will doubt whether a philosopher could even have final and actual opinions." One way of summarizing what begins to emerge from noting these passages is that Nietzsche, despite his reputation, does not appear to think that the center of philosophy, what makes it successful, are doctrines in the traditional sense. But he does claim to understand that, why it is so, and what follows from it. So we need a way of pointing out in some way where this is all leading. To do so, I suggest we take a close look at two supposedly doctrinal passages and see how he treats the apparent doctrines. These are paragraphs 34 and 36 in the second section of Beyond Good and Evil. In 34, they're essentially about perspectivism on the one hand and will to power on the other. In 34, he begins by discussing what he calls the erroneousness of the world, the Irrtümlichkeit der Welt, and mocks any philosopher who thinks error is to be attributed wholly to false inferring. He does not directly assert in his own voice that the world, on the contrary, shows itself falsely, resists rather than invites a way into its own intelligibility. He only says that there are reasons enough to lure us or tempt us into a speculation about a deceptive principle in the essence of things. Moreover, the modality in question is complicated because he introduces us to the world we might find erroneous or the occasion for false inferences by calling it the world we think we live in der wir zu leben glauben. In other words, he says, philosophers have mostly come up with wrong answers. How do we explain this? One answer, we're finite and weak infers. We don't know how to think very well because we're finite. Other answer, the world itself is hostile to its own intelligibility. It is deceptive. But when he tries to now explain how both of these should be understood, he puts a qualification at the beginning. He doesn't say, in the world we live in, all this will follow. He says, in the world we believe we live in. The subtle qualification, why else would he not say simply, the world we live in, contains the suggestion that everything that follows will be based on an implicit assumption about the world he might not share. For now, that possibility would send us off in another direction, but the qualification should always be kept in mind. His main interest here lies in characterizing psychologically, as before, what type of soul characterizes the claimant of such a view about bad inferences. If we could just get better at it, we'd be more successful at philosophy. Such a person, he says, is looking for an honorable way out of what one presumes is a kind of skeptical despair in philosophy. And a moment's reflection could convince anybody of skeptical despair. 2,000 years of the activity of philosophy and no consensus. Not a single agreed on conclusion. Not a single element of progress in the entirety of the history of philosophy that can be agreed on by practitioners of philosophy. The situation of contemporary philosophy, balkanized into camps that don't understand each other and can't talk to each other. There are many departments of philosophy in the United States where there are two epistemologists who have so little in common they can't have a discussion. One is a Bayesian probability theorist who works on stochastic reasoning, and the other is a 1950s S knows that P traditional condition for knowledge, and they have no common. Skeptical despair is not an idle possibility. And he's saying the people who are trying to say, we're just not very good at this, we have to get better. He said there's something touching and awe-inspiring about the innocence with which such a philosopher asks for a non-deceptive, non-reality distorted consciousness. And he then shifts topics to philosophers who believe in his way out of this in immediate certainties, unmittelbare Gewissheit. He's talking mostly about Descartes, starting all over again with an immediate certainty, as a path out of skepticism, but he describes such claims as really moral ones and as morally naive. Then the topic shifts again as Nietzsche praises the bad characters of always suspicious, mistrustful philosophers, but he suddenly begins to speak in the first person, dissatisfied with the tonality and affective tenor of such philosophical distrust, saying, something quite interesting. He learned a long time ago himself to address this question, the question of betraying and being betrayed by the world or our frail faculties, in a different manner than most philosophers. The different manner is lighthearted, playing jokes. And he says, with his elbow, giving a couple of rib nudges, Ribbenstöße, to philosophers who are in a rage about being betrayed by the world or by human thought and who end up in skepticism. He does not, that is, attempt to refute them or join them, but tries with humor and a playful nudge to diffuse, slightly mock their state of mind, not so much their doctrines. It is as if his reaction to the rage at being betrayed crowd is simply, yes, what you say is true, but relax, it's not such a big deal. This sort of reaction to those who find themselves dissatisfied at the philosophical level, in a rage at the untrustworthiness of any philosophical claim, is important to keep in mind in everything that follows. He doesn't make a doctrinal objection. He just says he'll respond with a playful Rippenstöße. Then, in his own voice, he begins to make a series of remarks that many have taken as canonical for his views on truth, as if all the stuff about skepticism weren't just there. Very famous claims. He says, it's a moral prejudice that truth is worth more than appearance. Many people think him to mean we can't say that. It isn't worth more than appearance. But again, typically, Nietzsche says that the assumption has not been proven true, that truth is worth more than appearance. He calls it die schlechtest bewiesene Annahme, the poorest proven assumption. Ironically, reestablishing immediately that truth is more important than mere appearance. We should not accept the assumption because we don't know if it's true. Life requires perspectival valuations and appearances, he says. One cannot abolish the world of appearances without also abolishing the possibility of truth. They are not polar opposites, true and false, but different, he says, levels of appearance. Quote, lighter and darker shades and tones of appearance, different valeurs. He does not assert, but he asks, why should not the world that is relevant to us be a fiction? If we ask for an author to this fiction, we should ask, again, he does not assert, whether that assumption is part of the fiction too. And then he ends with the unusual question, quote, aren't we allowed to be a bit ironic with the subject? Unquote. He goes on asking whether we should not be allowed to rise above belief in grammar, concluding with the same ironic, lighthearted tone of the passage, calling all such doctrines governess beliefs, Gouvernantenglauben, and encouraging philosophy to break free of such governess beliefs. Philosophers are like people who believe what their governesses told them about good and evil in the nursery. But this is what Nietzsche thinks of as an appropriate objection. It's another one of the elbow nudges, to the raging philosophers. So we are presented in this paragraph with what has been taken to be Nietzsche's doctrine of perspectivism. That truth appears differently to subjects in different perspectives. The perspective of life requires a perspective that is a fiction. We should reject the question of who authors such a fiction and so forth. Now, we obviously need to canvass many more passages where the term perspectivism is used or where the issue is relevant to offer any convincing account of the claim. All that can be said about this passage, and I believe it's quite significant given our topic, is that the idea in many of its details is presented here interrogatively, all in questions, and as if all part of the ironic nudges addressed to a specific audience, our enraged, embittered philosopher. Even what appear to be straight assertions have some sort of modal operator governing them. He does not simply say that there is no life not based on perspectival evaluations. He precedes that by saying, let us admit this much, as if appealing to a truism, as if what he wants to say depends on acceptance of the truism. He does not even say that there are shades of evaluations, but asks, isn't it enough to assume this? Genügt es nicht anzunehmen? The obvious thing to say is that Nietzsche appears to be looking for a style that allows a rejection of dogmatism without a reversion to a new dogmatism. We can at least say the following about it. The style seems to have a different illocutionary force than argumentative success. The tone is ironic and interrogative in a way that seems to be after a way of breaking the hold of various convictions about truth and falsity opposition in matters of evaluation, in reducing our confidence in them rather than making counter-assertions. Trying to make someone feel that their assumptions come from children's governesses is not a serious counterclaim, but exactly what Nietzsche says it is, a joke, a scherz, but a joke with a practical purpose. In terms of the book's title and general project, we can see here that being beyond good and evil is not living without the distinction, but without strict bivalence in moral matters, and with a refined sensibility for cases of the mutual imbrication of the values, and cases where the differences between them come in shades of different gradations. We need a kind of distinct esprit de finesse, in Pascal's famous terms, not an esprit géométrique. Or in Nietzsche's own terms, we need to be able to endure constant self-overcoming. There are no rules for acquiring such refinement, no procedure or rules for making out the gradations. One finally will need the same kind of sensibility Nietzsche is demanding of his readers, I want to suggest. an interpretive finesse or literary sensibility that Nietzsche wants to encourage, but not doctrinally. He suggests something like this interpretive imperative in paragraph 32 when discussing an intentionalist view of morality, like Kant's, the value of an action depends on the intention with which it is done. He notes that any putative intention ascribed, quote, is only a sign and symptom that first needs to be interpreted, and that, moreover, it is a sign that means too many things, and consequently means almost nothing by itself. This can still seem to mean that such a view of moral gradations requiring complex interpretation is a claim, nonetheless, masked with literary devices. But that would get both the content wrong and the purpose of the writing wrong, if we tried to sum it up that way as a thesis. That would be like saying Marcel's relation to Albertine in Proust's novel could be summarized in the phrase obsessive jealousy, and the wealth of narrative detail is just a dispensable, entertaining mask. We would not have understood that jealousy. It would not be the jealousy it is without the hundreds of pages and devices and metaphors necessary for its depiction. This is in keeping with an important passage from the preface to the second edition of the Gay Science. Tellingly, it is formulated figuratively. Quote, "And as for our future," hence the relevance to Beyond Good and Evil, "one will hardly find us again on the paths of those Egyptian youths who endangered temples by night, embraced statues, and want by all means to unveil, uncover, and put into bright light whatever is kept concealed for good reason. No, this bad taste, this will to truth at any price, this youthful madness in the love of truth have lost their charm for us. For that we are too experienced, too serious, too merry, too burned, too profound. We no longer believe that truth remains truth when the veils are withdrawn. We have lived too much to believe this," unquote. In this book, the point is made with different images in the last paragraph of the book, 296. Nietzsche, in saying goodbye to his painted thoughts, of course it's important that he doesn't say written, but painted, expresses regret that any sort of stability or fixity in having painted them is a false fixity, will always suggest a determinate doctrine that they cannot have. He addresses the book he has just written at the very end. It says, quote, "You have already lost your novelty, and I am afraid that some of you are ready to turn into truths. They already look so immortal, so pathetically decent and upright, so boring." Moreover, while it can sound like a banal cliche to insist that Nietzsche does not merely want to convince his readers of some doctrine, but to change them, transform them, it merits repeating. It already emerged explicitly in the preface with the suggestion that the implied goal was to inscribe eternal demands in the human heart, and that this required terrifying masks, a form, we can at least say, other than discursive. The point of the figurative language might also be to inspire the confidence now needed, as noted above. We had an example of the attempt in the staged dialogue between our ironic first-person expositor and our raging, disappointed philosophers. And this is all very much connected with the scope, let us say, of the perspectivism claim, that is, with what is perspectival. In the context of the first two sections and the announced purpose of the book as a whole, he clearly means perspectives on values, the results of evaluations, and ultimately good and evil. Nietzsche does not state the perspectival claim as an argument, but in the modally complex way described above, a way, I'm suggesting, tied to a distinct practical end, to inscribe something new on the human heart. As we saw above with the tortoise and frog types, and the necessity of misinterpretation by those in the lower, or in this metaphorical case, slower stage of perspective, as well as with the impossibility of writing books for a universal audience, perspectival orientations are often pointed to by Nietzsche as about distinctions in matters of significance, an appreciation of what matters and what does not. Sometimes he puts this in Platonic ways as a distinction between higher and lower, a distinction in kinds of soul, or taste. But he seems to be talking about a certain and somewhat strict limit on what one can convince another person matters, or ought to matter, at least by any traditional mode of compelling conviction. Plato is also relevant here because this is a Platonic theme. Virtue or excellence cannot be taught. A soul receptive to philosophy cannot be created. The kind of desire, or as Nietzsche sometimes puts it, the need necessary for philosophy, cannot be implanted or created. Many people will never feel it, but it can be awakened or inspired in some, either by beauty or by a midwife or by Socratic Elenchus. The task for the writer today is to find a way to awaken this implicit or potential desire, a rare and under much greater threat in a practical industrial age like ours. In other words, as many of you who are studying philosophy realize, in the public world, the persistence of philosophy and the identification of yourself as a philosopher is somewhat humorous. Americans don't tend to say that they're professors of philosophy when they're asked what they do. I've always found this quite embarrassing. They say, I'm a philosopher, which in America sounds a little bit like I'm a wizard, I'm a witch. It sort of, that disparity sort of makes the point that is also very prominent in the Socratic dialogues of Plato, where people are constantly telling Socrates, grow up. These are questions you ask when you're a child, but when you grow up, you start doing something. You make something, you run something. You don't just keep asking yourself, why this, why that, why this, why that. And in the Socratic dialogues, I think Nietzsche is evoking it here. Socrates is constantly looking for interlocutors who are responsive to what he's saying, but he can't create the conditions of the responsiveness. He has to assume it and hope that there's some initial potential birth that might be drawn out by the Socratic interrogation, not to convince the person that philosophy is the only life worth living, but in effect to kind of shame them if they're already inclined in that direction so that they'll give up what else they're doing and do philosophy. So perspectivism, I think, is mostly a reference to that Platonic theme, that we're talking about how one type of soul can't understand another type of soul. There's no way you could explain to somebody who isn't receptive to the idea in the first place that philosophy is valuable. But for most people, that would be like the question-begging nature of the old Aristotelian argument about whether we should do philosophy. Either we should or we shouldn't. If we should, well, we simply should. And if we shouldn't, we should find out why we shouldn't. Something funny about that argument for most people. Assuming we mean mainly truths about what is valuable, significant, important, what matters, what we care about, or can be inspired to care about. The assertion of perspectival truth has this dimension, relativized to psychic dispositions that can be inspired but not created, as in the remarks in paragraph 43. Quote, in the end, it has to be as it is and as it always has been. Great things are left for the great, abysses for the profound, delicacy and trembling for the subtle, and all in all, everything rare for those who are rare themselves, unquote. And this reading is relevant to many of the earlier images. Philosophical interrogation about value, importance, significance is desired or inspires a desire or not, seems important or not, can be inspired but not created. It is, to go all the way back to the beginning of the book, like love in that respect, not subject to arguments about what ought to matter or be loved. In that respect, like a woman, or in general, a beloved. Most philosophers have been clumsy because they assume the opposite, as if giving arguments to the beloved about why the lover should be loved is the heart of courtship. I mean, nothing would be more ridiculous than that, to try to persuade somebody to love you because you're objectively lovable. It doesn't work that way. It doesn't work that way in philosophy either, according to Nietzsche. Now, I've basically run out of time, but I have one more section I'll just mention about the will to power. This is the famous paragraph 36. But that's the paragraph that concludes. I think I've said enough to indicate just how different this passage would be read if we were to take account of the literary context of the book as a whole. The world seen from the inside. Who in the world would think Nietzsche believes that the world has a clear inside and a clear outside? The world seen from the inside, the world determined and described with respect to its intelligible character. Who would seriously believe that Nietzsche thinks this Platonic Kantian term, its intelligible character, is meant without irony? Would be, wäre, not is, would be this will to power and nothing else. So, and I mean, this last section is about how strange the paragraph with the will to power doctrine, really the clearest place in the published works where the will to power is mentioned, how strange the paragraph is. First he says, might it not be true that everything in the mechanical world is like everything in the organic world, and that all events are caused by a conflict of wills? I mean, as if fire heating water to boil is like one will overcoming another will. And then he says, of course, we do this because it's always important for everything to be traced back to one causal principle. Who could believe that Nietzsche thinks that's true? That there has to be everything reduced to it. And then he says we have to push that hypothesis to its absurdity, that the mechanical world is also governed by the will to power. And then he says, if we had the morals of a mathematician, this is the way we would think. I think all of these qualifications and contextualizations are lost in people who say, well, look, in paragraph 36, Nietzsche says the world is will to power and nothing else, so what more is there to say? Well, I won't go through the details because I don't want to stop you tomorrow. I'll leave you time for discussion, but thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Robert, for this wonderful, inspiring presentation. We have an hour or even a bit more if we want. So who wants to ask the first question? Everyone hesitates to ask the first one.
Yeah, I know.
Please.
Thank you very much for the presentation. Would you conclude from your present work on Beyond Good and Evil that we should reread Nietzsche as someone who hasn't any positive doctrine, that his stance would be rather critical, maybe in Kant's sense, thoroughly critical,
Yeah.
like a critique of all previous philosophy,
Yeah.
even like Socrates.
Yeah, that's a very important question, because the difficulty with the approach I'm trying to defend is that it's right on the edge of the contemporary postmodern appropriation of Nietzsche. And I don't want it to be confused with that. In other words, there are readings of Nietzsche, I mean, Derrida's in Spurs especially, in which the point is to show how Nietzsche shows us the complete indeterminacy of language, the impossibility of referentiality or determinate conceptual content, the constant necessity of taking with one hand what one's given with another, the inherently self-contradictory, in which everything just collapses into a kind of play of signifiers. Absolutely not. So there has to be a way, in other words, of distinguishing between the impossibility of any final resolvability about the distinction between good and evil, on the one hand, and the dogmatic claim about the necessary irresolvability of any such claim. The absence of final irresolvability is not the same as the necessity of complete irresolvability. That distinction is a bit difficult to defend, but it is the heart of the way I want to defend the claim that he's not saying, I have no positive view to maintain. He is, in a way, like Montaigne in the preface to the essays. He's offering himself as an example of the beginning of a kind of new form of life. And a new form of life isn't a doctrinal thesis. I mean, the Socratic form of life can't really be put in it. You have to see it in the dialogue. It's not positive. It's positive. But it's not a set of principles. It's not a set of truths. It's not the categorical imperative. It's not the dialectical notion of negation. It's not, the meaning of being. It's not formulatable that way, and that's why it's so difficult. But it is meant to be an evocation of a philosophically inspired kind of life that isn't dogmatic in the pre-critical sense. But it's not utter irresolvability and the endless play of ironic signifiers either. That's, I think, not to give any credit to the passion of Nietzsche's enterprise, which clearly isn't inspired by the dissolution of all determinate meaning. I don't want to go that far to suggest that we need another framework, maybe the framework of Socrates or Montaigne or Pascal or his early hero Schopenhauer, who wasn't a professional philosopher, didn't teach in the academy. He was more interested in music in a certain sense than he was in the technique of philosophy. People like that, or like Proust. So if we think of Proust, we would not say that Proust has doctrines that are in the book. In the same way, this will come up in the talk tonight too. In the same way that we wouldn't want to say that Othello has in it a theory about jealousy. It doesn't. It's about Othello's jealousy. But it can't be about Othello's jealousy unless it's informed by some very sophisticated view of the human propensity for jealousy. It's just that that view can't be put in a psychological thesis. Every time you do that, you miss more than you gain by doing it. So that's a question I have a lot of difficulty with, because I want very much to keep on this side of the postmodern play of signifier, indeterminacy, non-referentiality view of Nietzsche.
I know Nietzsche very well. I think that it didn't mean that kind of postmodern.
Yeah, I took no positive doctrine to mean.
Yeah, no, because you mentioned the word critique, so the idea would be that there are still constraints that Nietzsche has to respect, and so he's criticizing other views according to, in terms of those constraints, norms, commitments, and so on, and so it's not an absolute free play of signifiers. Self-deconstructing free play like in Derrida. But then the question, of course, is what constraints does Nietzsche believe he still has to comply with?
Yeah. The ones that emerge in the text are things like the virtue of Redlichkeit, honesty, of intellectual conscience, intellectual Gewissen in the gay side. But again, the difficulty is extracting sort of a critical constraint as a principle to which one is committed by virtue of arguments. So one way of saying what the reorientation amounts to is that the presentation of the compellingness of a position is not for Nietzsche generated by the compellingness of argument in the traditional philosophical sense. And I think for most, but in a way by something like a picture of living this way rather than that way. It's a very, I feel like a kind of Wittgensteinian position. We can only feel the grip of a certain deep picture loosening if we have an intimation of another picture. And in a way, all Nietzsche's trying to do is give us another picture that isn't tied to the Platonic Christian dogmatist, Kantian traditional rationalist assumption about what justifies a commitment.
So I also have lots of questions as I usually do. But in this context, Nietzsche often appeals to taste and good taste.
Yeah.
So a set of constraints that are not epistemological or moral, but in some sense aesthetic or having to do with taste, and they seem to be very much like aesthetic principles in Kant, insofar as they are not determinate concepts. They are in some way there are rules that one is trying to obey to, but they are not like the rules of morality or the rules of science, epistemology, and so on. So would you find this path of connecting Nietzsche with the third critique a fruitful one in order to respond to the postmodern objection?
Yeah, it just depends on how far one goes with the analogy. So the first part of the analogy is absolutely the case, because Kant introduced the idea that there are distinctions in taste that are not like empirical distinctions and not like a priori moral distinctions, but they're not merely subjective responses to phenomena that have no general subjective universal validity. And so Nietzsche is exactly saying the same thing. That is, it's a mistake to think that introducing as a kind of decider in moral orientations something like taste is to introduce a subjectively relativistic and undecidable, incommensurable differentiation among people's responsiveness to the world. Some have taste, some don't. Some have this kind of taste, some don't. But the question is, what happens in the next step? The next step for Kant is a deduction of the subjective universal validity of taste based on a certain conception of human conceptual powers that can be said to be brought into play in a way that, although it's still true that if someone doesn't find something beautiful in Kant, this is the real source of the similarity. If someone doesn't find something beautiful, Kant argued, you can't argue them into finding it beautiful. There aren't arguments you can give them. And a great deal of, I mean, not just Nietzsche, but a great deal of post-Kantian, post-third critique, Schelling in his lectures on art, Schiller, the Athenaeum, this kind of the enormous revolution that the third critique provoked, that there could be distinctions in taste that couldn't be argued for but were still binding in some way. The trouble is, one can't follow Kant when one then asks, well, how do we explain the bindingness of claims of taste that can't be argued into? But if you don't find it beautiful, I can't argue you into finding it beautiful, but you ought to find it beautiful. Still, there's something deficient in you, something wrong. You're missing something. But you're not missing an objective property in the world, for Kant either, as in perfectionist or classicist conceptions of the beautiful. And it isn't just that your faculties are misfunctioning like an empirical conception. It's not just like there's some disease going on. In a way, there's really ultimately no explanation for it. And that's why this perspectivism in Nietzsche, I think, is meant to say we've got to conclude something more radical than Kant concluded, that not only is there no way to argue someone else into having your taste, there's no general argument in defense of the subjective universal validity of the principle of taste either, where we're left without that. And it still doesn't follow that it's merely an empirical distinction between a bunch of people who like philosophy and the vast majority of people who find it ridiculous. That's not true either. It's higher and more important, but you can only explain that to people who already understand it. So it's just that you can't go the next step with Kant and then try to explain why the absence of an argumentative distinction, argumentatively based distinction, doesn't lead to a kind of simplistic subjective relativism. You can't then say, well, I've already proven in the first critique that we all have the capacities for understanding and sensibility, and there's nothing that prevents us from saying these should be in free play on the occasion of the beautiful form of an object meta. And you then have to ask, well, if Nietzsche doesn't have that, what does he have? Well, he has these books written in this tremendously unusual way, meant to be a kind of compelling conviction for those who can be persuaded in that way. I mean, you and I were talking before. I had a section in this paper that I took out that trying to explain this, because I can't find anywhere where Nietzsche refers to the Gospel of St. Mark. He does refer to the Gospel of St. Matthew at the beginning of the genealogy of morals quite explicitly, and there are implicit references to Christian doctrine all the way through Nietzsche's oeuvre. But the Gospel, chapter 4 of the Gospel of St. Mark is so interesting in this respect for Nietzsche, because it's Mark is the Gospel writer who said most explicitly that Jesus never spoke in public except in parables. Mark is the most explicit about this. And when he tells the story of the sower and the seed, this is the parable, I assume most of you know, that the sower throws his seed to the field. Some of it lands on the road and doesn't grow at all. Some of it lands on the side of the road where there's a little dirt, and it grows, but its roots don't go very deep, so when the first wind and rain comes, it's blown away. Some of it falls on better soil and grows and has deeper roots, but there's too many thorns and brambles around it, and it's choked off. And some fortunately falls on, you can see where this is going, some fortunately falls on receptive soil, and it grows strong and healthy and blah, blah, blah. So the apostles say to Jesus, what the hell are you talking about? But it's their most explicit complaint. Why do you talk like this all the time? What does this mean? And Jesus is very angry. He says, if you don't understand this, how are you going to understand anything? And they said, well, okay, you've got a point, but we don't understand it. And so then he explains to them. He said, I'm talking about my words. And sometimes my words fall on ears that are so unreceptive, there's no resonance at all. And sometimes my words have a little bit of resonance, but they don't go very deep. And pretty soon they're forgotten. And sometimes they have a lot of resonance, and the roots go deep, but there are too many temptations of the world. And sometimes they have a good audience. They find the right audience. But then he says, but this means, and here in a way really a shocking, inegalitarian thing to say, he says, this means that to him who already has much, much will be given. And from him who has very little, even this very little will be taken away. Let him who has ears to hear and eyes to see understand. And basically by summing up, he says, I speak this way, and he says this explicitly, in order not to be understood, so that I may not be understood. And that's, I think, the resonance Nietzsche's trying, I think that's a reference to St. Mark, where he says, am I doing everything I can so that I won't be understood? At the beginning of Beyond Good and Evil. I think that's a reference to the sower and the seed parable. But it's the same problem. If you say, well, Christ, you can't just write off people like that. I mean, can't you persuade them that you ought to live better? Basically, he says no. It's not about argumentative persuasion. And then you say, well, I mean, this is terrible. People say this about Nietzsche all the time. This is inegalitarian. He thinks there's an elite of tastemakers and people. This is Habermas's criticism the philosophical discourse of modernity, said we can't reduce all civilized life to a distinction between an elite with a certain amount of taste and everybody else who doesn't have it. And the answer to that is, read the Gospel of St. Mark. You're going to find essentially the same claim, that there's a philosophical orientation in life is something one cannot create, argue for, give a transcendental deduction of. And so we can make the first step with Kant. Yes, you can't argue someone into accepting your claim of taste. But we can't make the second step, that nevertheless there's a basis that philosophy can provide on the basis of which we can say they ought to have the experience of the beautiful.
Although in Nietzsche's, in Kant's third critique, there's also the idea that you cannot demonstrate that something is beautiful, but you can discuss it.
Mm-hmm.
And that is more Nietzschean. He gives the example of music all the time.
Mm-hmm.
He writes a lot about music. What he's saying about music is a matter of taste, but he wants it to be discussed and further discussed.
Right. But it's also the case that he thinks philosophy, a priori philosophy, can provide a transcendental deduction of the principle of the judgment of taste.
First of all, thank you very much for this presentation. I would like to go a bit back and continue the question from by Louise. I do agree with you that Nietzsche has something positive to say, even if it's not always clear what. Because Nietzsche clearly praises contradiction, for example, and often he says very contradictory things. My question would be if you have some strategy, or how can you tell when he's endorsing a view or just criticizing? Because sometimes it's just, I'm remembering, for example, this chapter on women, on Beyond Good and Evil. It's really hard to tell if he's like endorsing those views or just criticizing, for example, the views of his time. It's not clear at all. And I have the impression that perspectivism can also be applied to Nietzsche, where Nietzsche is read in very many different perspectives. And it seems to me that Nietzsche has said or claimed everything possible, so you can always speak Nietzsche to support your own view about anything.
Yeah.
So, and when you were speaking about this paragraph of Beyond Good and Evil 36, you were like clearly saying, can anybody believe that Nietzsche would endorse such a thing, that Nietzsche would believe such a thing? But how can you tell?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that's a very good question, but it isn't a question that one can give any better answer to than one can give. We've all been present, for example, when, say, an art historian of great talent shows us something in a painting that we didn't see before. And we're just, the light bulb goes off. Oh my God, that's right. Look at that. And then another person says, that was a terrible lecture. I didn't understand any of it. You didn't see what he was talking about? No, I didn't see what he was talking about. So my response is, we give up on Nietzsche too quickly because we go to the level of principle like this and we don't notice how carefully the text is written. So the question would be only, have I provided enough compelling literary details in the analysis of that passage to prove that it's, in a way, a kind of presentation of what somebody reading Nietzsche would think if they believed there were an intelligible character inside of things that could be said to be the will to power, rather than Nietzsche asserting it. I mean, the other problem here is we don't know what he means by everything being the will to power. In the Genealogy of Morals, he says the conflict of power is a conflict of interpretations. So one thing has power over it. I mean, so one goes on to other passages where he says in the Gay Science that the idea of exerting power over another is a demonstration of the lack of power. The real powerful don't care about that. They're indifferent to their ability to control the wills of other people. So one begins to pull in from other passages in other texts, carefully read, what Nietzsche says about what he might mean by the will to power, even given the qualified view in 36. And either one has the details to back up the interpretation, or one doesn't. It's like the same sort of thing one would say about somebody claiming that in the Antigone by Sophocles, Antigone's relationship to her sister, Ismene, demonstrates that there's a kind of fanaticism and coldness in Antigone that deflates her role as a heroine. Well, do you have evidence in the play that that's true? And I think we're left in the same way with Nietzsche. Do the details support the interpretation or not? I disagree very strongly with, I mean, you raised this as a hypothetical, so I'm not meaning you, but I disagree very strongly with the view that you can make Nietzsche mean anything you want. No, you can't. If you read it very closely, he writes very, very carefully. It's a terrible thing with students. They read Nietzsche very quickly, and he says all the time, I am dynamite. If you're not careful with me, you're going to believe a lot of things that you shouldn't believe.
Just that historically, we know it was.
Yeah.
Nazism, for example.
Yeah, agonized over things.
I thought it was so.
Yeah, no, exactly. No,
it's a fact.
But I take the point because many people believe this. I mean, Nietzsche says all the time that there's no distinction between good and evil, that everything is the will to power, that nobody can talk to anybody else because we're all in our own perspectives, that that we ought to kill the weak and breed the strong, and no. You have. I mean, the trouble is this is what is said by Nietzsche scholars. This mode of close reading is not popular. I mean, here's one of the most important Nietzsche commentator in Europe in the 20th century is Martin Heidegger, whose lectures on Nietzsche in the 1930s never deal with a single published text. They're all referring to the Nachlass, where you don't have to do this. It's very canny, clever of Heidegger. The Nachlass are kind of notes to himself, letters to himself. You can see the difference right away between the hypothetical assumptions in the Nachlass and the literary formulations in the actual work. So I don't have a better answer except this is a question that always arises with an interpretation, and it's on balance, do the things one cites in favor of one's interpretation support it or not? Are there conflicting passages that, I mean, as you said, if there are conflicting passages that seem a good deal more clear, that conflict with what I'm saying about its hesitancy and modality, let's hear it. That's all you can say is let's hear it. Let's hear the contrary interpretation.
Don't you think that sometimes the thesis might be the undecidability itself? For example, determinism, free will, for example, seems to defend both theses. Do we have to decide for one of them? Or
Yeah.
The thesis or Nietzsche's claim is really the undecided.
Well, in the passage after he writes, he in 37, when he's just gotten through apparently saying that everything is the will to power and nothing else in its intelligible character, he then he does this very often, kind of creates a character who then speaks in the book, who says, what, does this mean that God is refuted but the devil is not? Somebody just, whoever it is, somebody just asked this question in the middle of the text. And the point is, you're trying to say that the idea of a beneficent God and a purposive universe, a universe that has a point, that has an internal meaning, that's been refuted. It's just all will to power, so the devil's view is now correct. Isn't that what you just said? And Nietzsche says, to the contrary, he says twice, im Gegenteil. Now that's also very, very complicated. He could mean one of two things. He could mean, no, God is not refuted, God is still unrefuted, to the contrary. But that would be very strange, to say that a world dominated by the will to power is a divinely purposive world of traditional Christianity. So he must mean, when he says im Gegenteil, to the contrary. these categories are ridiculous. They don't capture what I'm trying to say. And that seems to be what he's after, because he then says, and zum Teufel, he then says, by the devil, the curse, by the devil, who made you use these oppositions, these terms anyway? So he immediately suggests that the inference we make from this, the world is a purposeless play of warring forces struggling merely for power, is a devilish interpretation that misconstrues the choices we have as either for God and purposiveness and meaningfulness, or for the devil, contingency, chaos, meaninglessness. Then 38, the next paragraph, all in a kind of stream of possible interpretability. This goes back to the question of whether he has anything positive to say, because it's not as if he wants to say that everything is awash in infinite interpretability. That it could sound like I'm saying that as well, that there's this interminability of interpretability. It goes on and on and on. In answering your question, we would just get into an endless back and forth about passages and possible meanings and allusions to things. And he says, no. And he doesn't seem to be responding to that, but he is. He says, what's happened in the 19th century is that the text of the French Revolution, I don't know if you remember this passage or not, he says, what's happened is that the text of the French Revolution has been overwhelmed by interpretations. We make it mean what we want it to mean, and we should never do that. So there's still a difference between text and interpretation. Not everything is endless interpretability, that the text is just another interpretation of a text. There's no text. So he says that's not true. So it's, in a way, it's kind of anticipating your question. It says, I know what it sounds like. It sounds like I'm for the side of the devil against God, and it sounds like all I will allow is infinite interpretability. But I reject that duality, that exclusive disjunction, and I'm not like the people who want the text of the French Revolution to disappear under our self-serving interpretations. But again, all one can do is, I think, do what people do not do in looking at Nietzsche. Read very closely what he says and ask questions about why he says it. I mean, there have been people commenting on Nietzsche for 100 years now. I write this way because it's appropriate for the shame of a god. Why has no one ever asked what he means by that? I mean, it's the most important thing he can say. Why do I write this way? And he says something quite mysterious, which is not part of the conventional discourse about Nietzsche. Same thing with Truth as a Woman, same thing with Clumsy Lovers, same thing with the Sphinx and Oedipus. One could go on and on and on and on.
There's a thesis being written now about Shane.
About Shane and Nietzsche.
About Shane.
Good. Yours?
No, in Basel. I don't remember the name, but I can tell.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, as I said, in Beyond Good and Evil, it mostly comes up as a thread in between everything he says about women. But there are these three passages in which he tries to explain what a shame of a god means. The initial one in 40, and then 65, and then 66, and then finally brings it together in 289, where he says, I mean, again, why is there no interpretation of this? He says, I write this way because of the shame of a god. The shame of a god is the shame of being duped for the entire history of the world until the death of God. There is a God without shame. And I think a lot of people quote this, Dionysus wants to help man become stronger, more evil, more profound, and then finally more beautiful, and don't notice that Nietzsche says, oh, this God lacks a lot more than shame. He's got something to learn from us humans, because we are more human. I mean, in other words, he completely dissociates himself. This is a long-winded answer, but I think there is interpretive evidence for reading Nietzsche one way rather than another. And this is what I'm trying to do.
Anna, here.
I don't know if I will be able to articulate my question, but I'm writing a paper on shame now, not about Nietzsche, but from Williams, Kant, ended up with Nietzsche. And I was, all the time we were speaking, I was thinking of this very famous essay by Jane Coetzee, Professional Double Thoughts, which is the piece I'm focusing on now. And he explores how can we find the question, how can we find the last motive of shame, and he goes through an interpretation of the text Kosovo, Dostoevsky, and he ends up in a very mysterious way by apparently settling on what Tolstoy has to say in the afterword to Milton on the underground about what he meant by the text. So he came up with a public explanation of what was going on in the text, and Coetzee ends his own essay saying, well, maybe we can assume that after a lifelong struggling with the topic, the author has gathered the authority to claim what he meant by what he wrote. But then it took me a while to realize that Coetzee has a parenthetical remark where he says, well, I speculate now. Remember that? And I was wondering if, in a less speculative or tentative way, the last remark of your talk was aiming at the same provisional settling on at least a pause for the discussion in order to restart it again. Because you say, well, he ended up defending that the world is built to power. What else do we have to know? So would you accept this sort of breaking off of the dialectic in order to be resumed again?
Yeah, I mean, if I understand you, I think the way I would put it would be there's a great deal of irony. I mean, irony is a very complex thing. It's not just not saying what you mean. And when Socrates says, I don't know anything, and you think that's ironic because he means I know a lot more than the rest of you. But, I mean, that's a simple version of it, but there's a deep truth in that kind of irony. Sometimes irony means to say exactly the opposite of what you believe, as a way of making fun of the opposite of what you believe. You pretend to be in the voice of a character who believes something in order to reveal how stupid it is to believe it is. I don't think Nietzsche's doing that. I think he is, though, saying something like, this is what I would be taken to mean if someone were reading me very simplistically. That the world is nothing but a meaningless, chaotic play of opposing forces, call them wills. Right? So the passage is meant as if I had a thesis that was a metaphysics, if I believed in the intelligible character of the world, if I believed in the inside of things, if I were to follow the morals of a mathematician, if I were to believe that we ought to reduce all explanation to one principle, this would be it. And I think that is...
But what about if irony is not a way of meaning, indicating that you mean the opposite of what you say, but that you only mean half of it?
Yeah, no, that's what I'm saying. There's one sense of irony which is just mocking. This is the last thing I believe. But in this sense, it's not implausible to believe that Nietzsche has some sort of view about the contestation of, especially interpretation, as a kind of key element in at least human conduct. So I agree with you. It's not half believe, maybe that's a way of putting it. And I think this is exactly what Coetzee means. I mean, he does believe that every work is a confession of its author. That's his phrase. And I think he's very sympathetic to the thought that it's an involuntary confession. You think you're confessing X in writing Y, but what you're not really aware of until after you've finished is that you were actually confessing Z. You're not as much in control of the... I mean, this goes to the issue... I'm trying to write something about summertime. These three so-called autobiographical accounts of Coetzee, and in each one, the connection with the actual true facts of his life becomes less and less clear. And that's in each one, so boyhood, youth, summertime. In the first one, most of what he says is true. We know from biographical details that it's true. In the second one, he makes up a few things. And what he makes up are very damning to him. He's very irresponsible and cold to a woman he's gotten pregnant who's having an abortion. And he's merciless.
It's the brother that's
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
passage in the book.
Yeah. And then in summertime, he's supposed to be dead. And somebody is interviewing people about him, and it's just the most horrible things you can imagine. Oh, yeah, I remember he was a terrible lover. He was boring. He had bad breath. He was just terrible. So, in a way, he's sort of playing with the idea of revealing things about himself as if the worse they could be, the closer they would be to be the truth that he's afraid of about himself. And he'd get some control over it. But that's also a kind of game, or at least the modality of its presentation isn't just truth-telling. I think he's very, very suspicious of people who say, now I'm going to tell you the truth about myself.
Yeah, but still the way he resists the telling of the truth. I'm asking this. I
Yeah.
don't ask you if you agree with me or not. It's entirely different in the novels, even in the so-called autobiographic novels you're referring to, as opposed to the essays. Because I must confess something now, I was absolutely furious when I ended the essay on confession.
Mm-hmm.
And because he seems to be talking about himself. Now
I'm telling you the truth.
I'm telling you the truth about what the deep motivation behind shame is. And it took me quite a while to zoom on that parenthetical remark.
Yeah.
It's still very tentative.
Yeah.
And still the essay doesn't show a very ironic note, does it? No.
Yeah. Do you know the newest work, this correspondence he has with the psychoanalyst?
No.
Yeah, this is quite relevant to this because there's a Dutch psychoanalyst. It's like the correspondence with Paul Auster.
That one I know.
Yeah, this is another one, and it's a correspondence about self-honesty and truth about yourself with a psychoanalyst. I forget what it's called. It's been translated. Just came out in English. It came out first in Dutch.
I'm so sorry, Sean.
Yeah, it's quite relevant to the topic of redlichkeit, or honesty about oneself. But if you're the name of it will come to me. But if you go to Amazon and look for the latest thing published by him.
So it was written in Afrikaans original, is what you said?
No, it was written in English. He writes in English, she writes in Dutch, but his Dutch publisher wanted to publish it first. So it just happened to come out in, I don't think he would ever write anything in Afrikaans, but it just happened to come out first in Dutch because the publisher wanted it first in Dutch because the psychoanalyst was a Dutch woman. But it's now out in English, and it's about this theme, about what it means to tell the truth about yourself. But I take your general point that with some authors, we can't be sure of the difference between essays and fiction, as if it's simply a difference between what I believe and what I make up about other people believe. That distinction is unstable. I think that's right. He doesn't feel a commitment to tell the truth in the essays about what he really thinks, because he writes in the voice. I think this is actually also going on with the Paul Auster correspondence. The idea that you can now read what he really thinks by reading what he says to Paul Auster. I think he's playing with that. He's writing to Paul Auster, to that person, in that context. And he's perfectly aware that that can't be generalized about as the truth about John Coetzee's opinions or views. Quite aware of that. This has to do with the prevalence of another issue in Nietzsche that is, I think, poorly understood, and that is the character of the nature of self-deceit in Nietzsche's characterization of most everyone else, and then the implications of that characterization for himself. This is like the caves beneath the caves business, because first of all, it's a tremendously complicated topic. What does it mean to say that the religious and the philosophical communities have lived their entire existence in self-deceit. It's not that that's why they're ashamed. They haven't just, if you're duped, tricked by someone, you feel ashamed very often because you let yourself be tricked. You wanted to believe it. So there's an element in a con game or a con man, a crook who swindles you out of your money. The reason you're ashamed is that if it was something you could never be expected to have known, you're just bad luck. It's like, if a storm hits and your house falls down, you're not ashamed. You couldn't have predicted this would happen to you. And if somebody swindles you by stealing money out of your checking account, by hacking your identity, you're not ashamed. But if somebody comes to you with a proposition and asks you to invest and tells you a story about how you're going to get rich quick, and you believe the person and then you're swindled, then you're ashamed, but you're ashamed because you know finally that you wanted to believe this, that you're as responsible as the con man. Same thing in politics. The deceit that goes on in politics is a two-way street. This is another Bernard Williams, an article called Politics and Self-Deceit. It's not just that the country's being fooled by a manipulative politician. That's not the way Nietzsche would look at it. The conditions for the success of the manipulative politician are people want to be deceived. But what is that? Wanting to be deceived. It's not like they say to themselves, I want to be deceived. I think I'm going to believe this. I know it's not true, but I'm going to believe it anyway. No. But it's also not like you're faultless, guiltless, and something happens to you. The bargain is very complicated. I like the bargain between a writer and an audience in Nietzsche as well. So this is another kind of master concept in Nietzsche. I don't think commentators have given us a good account of, because he's also aware, as is Coetzee, of the reflective possibility pertaining to himself. That his own, that's part of the hesitation. If every philosopher is a confession of its author and it's involuntary, what am I involuntarily confessing? And what does that mean about the status of the work I'm presenting to the world? So, how to avoid self-deceit, how to expose it, how to deal with it when one thinks it's unavoidable is a master trope in Nietzsche, a master concept. That's why Christianity should be explained this way rather than another way, because the slaves have deceived themselves about morality and selflessness and so on and so forth. So this.
Do you not believe that Nietzsche do you believe that Nietzsche himself had an answer to the question he was just posing?
Well, Nietzsche in a way is more careful than Coetzee, because he's always writing, let's assume that, or it could be the case that, or suppose we just entertain the possibility that. There's much more explicit modal qualification on what he's saying. That's why he said the new philosophers of the future will occupy themselves mostly with vielleicht, with perhaps.
And they are worth for the question marks that they came up with, not with the answers.
Yeah.
Right.
So,
it's 2 o'clock. Some of you may be anxious to leave. But we still have time, and we started 15 minutes late. If you have to leave, please.
Yeah, sorry.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you for obrigado por terem vindo.
Come to an after talk.
For those who resist, and if you are not too tired.
No.
And if you have questions, I have lots of questions. But just one more for Margaret. when you talked about the will to power, you said that the usual view is that the will to power says debunk our most noble aspirations. But then Nietzsche contradicts that interpretation of the will to power. And in fact, one of the most prominent themes in Beyond Good and Evil is nobility, what is noble, being noble. Free spirits are noble inside the soul. There is this pathos of distance, which is an inner pathos of this distance and not a social one. And the book is full of, I already mentioned this to you, the book is full with spatial metaphors to describe what nobility is about and what being noble is. You know, distance is one, and the most important is the heights and being high above perhaps previous views that one has criticized, that one has overcome. Also the metaphor of depth and going into the depths. Also the image of the cave belongs to that. How do you see this idea of nobility? What is noble? The question of the pragmatic section.
Well, I mean, don't you think he mostly is successful at telling us what it's contrasted with? You know, a certain kind of small-mindedness. I mean, to some extent it has to do with some kind of possibility, not of transcendence in the traditional sense, but of escape from the mundane world of interest satisfaction. So somebody who's interested in, I mean, we say this casually, so we have to interrogate what we mean, but we say that someone, I mean, this is a current issue in the crisis about the place of humanities education in the university. There's something better about not being completely occupied with your own comfortable existence, with the idea of wealth, security, happiness, the reduction of opposition, peace, serenity. There's something Nietzsche says is cow-like, bovine about that. You just want to be a contented cow. But the question is, on what basis does Nietzsche claim that some of the values that clearly he thinks of as higher than that, say the appreciation of art, or music in general, but of art even more generally, or a taste for philosophical issues, is the revelation of a higher kind of soul. Well, you know, in Plato, that's a Platonic thesis, very much a Platonic thesis. But in Plato, there's a whole ontology of the soul and a whole worldview about the kind of objects the world has to have in it for that to make sense. That beauty is more important than mere pleasure. And so I think, you know, Nietzsche has very much a kind of Platonic conception of freedom from what look like the mundane concerns of the body and of security and happiness and peace. But I think it's a fair question to ask, does he really have any kind of worked out view of why some things are supposed to be higher than others? Is it just a matter of taste? Either you see it or you don't? If it's just that, then we're sort of left at a level of agreement among those things, but then a level of very violent disagreement within that level about what things really count as significant and what don't. I don't think he wants to give us any kind of programmatic answer about how a noble person should lead their life. You know, like this, like that, like this, like that, like this. But he does want to break the hold on us, to make us in a way ashamed of being only concerned with kind of venal self-interest. But if he doesn't have the Platonic kind of world within which that makes a certain kind of sense, and that's in a way you can sort of say that's his greatest problem, the one he's most afraid of. That is to say, if we really do live in, I mean, one of the great powerful things about Nietzsche is to make you feel what an unbelievable alteration it is for the educated elite no longer to be religious. So, 5,000 years of civilization, and one of the highest manifestations of nobility was a religious indifference to the mere concerns of the body and the temporal life, that kind of transcendence. And now, within just 150 years, suddenly all of that has gone. And I think he just assumes that no really serious person, well-educated, exposed to the great literature and philosophy of the world, could possibly be seriously religious anymore. But is there something that can replace this kind of nobility of spirit? And as you know, in the early part of his career, he thought it was art. There could be an aesthetic justification. And then he came to be completely disabused of that notion. And I think he spent the rest of his career looking for some other way to formulate a way out of we're just all mutually interest-satisfying beasts who are trying to accommodate each other in some sort of compromised political situation, without there being anything worthy of striving for other than death. So it's not going to be philosophy as it's traditionally understood. It's not going to be religion. I mean, for a while he seems to think it has something to do with being good Europeans.
In Beyond Medieval, it also seems to be a way of life he calls the free spirit of free spiritedness, and it seems to be already writing from that perspective. And the noble perspective is the one he adopts as the perspective of the free spirit, and then he's trying to. He's not justifying that from in the third person. He's saying, well, this is what flourishing is for me, and so he describes it and he contrasts it with the last man, the herd, and so on. Could that be the way to read him? That he's adopting this perspective of free-spiritedness and considering the optimum conditions for being a free spirit in a world that has lost God and so on.
Yeah. It depends on, I mean, what kind of a life one has to factor into your, on the other hand, Nietzsche's admiration for a kind of rather direct political realism. That is, his admiration for Thucydides, Machiavelli, for example, of there being a kind of clear-sightedness about the consequences of this transition in the late modern world that isn't idealistic, that is, as fully aware of the corruption of the human soul as Thucydides and Machiavelli. Then there's the other side. There's the side that admires Shakespeare and Goethe. So the question could be, how could somebody put together an admiration with Thucydides and Machiavelli on the one hand, with an admiration of the kind of divinity of Shakespeare and Goethe on the other hand? And that goes to all these virtues that a noble person, Ja-Sagen. How can someone live an affirmative life? I don't think you can say Machiavelli and Thucydides live in the Ja-Sagen des Lebens. They don't live a yes-saying life. But, I mean, especially now, that sounds to us so much like a kind of psychological self-help manual. Be a yes-sayer. Be affirmative, There's just no way to avoid banality. It also has to do with amor fati, with being able to not regard what has happened as a loss, which is one aspect of late modern counter-enlightenment thought, that like Strauss, we've just come to a point where we've lost what makes life worth living. And that's terrible, we have to learn to live with that. And he wants to avoid that as well. and I think you're right, he doesn't have a kind of direct definition of nobility. It has to do with this unbelievable complex of things to admire and things to worry about that we live in a kind of tension with. Perhaps that's it. I mean, a noble person is one with sufficient honesty to be quite worried about the status of nobility. That alone is without, in a way,
It's already a mark of nobility.
Yeah, right. And someone who isn't concerned about that is lost, is not worthy of serious philosophical consideration, somebody who isn't concerned with that. I mean, as I say, this is an aspect in contemporary discussions of how should we educate people in university. Because arguments in behalf of insisting on reading great literature, exposure to great art, great music, all have some indefensible, in a kind of utilitarian sense, indefensible element that can't really be made public. If you say in a country with a state university system that the only things that make life worth living are things university students study, politically that's catastrophic. Most people don't go to university. So you can't get up and say, well, for the rest of you, never mind, because you can't have access to the things that make life worth living. But those of you who go to university, we want to make sure you do. You can't say that. So you could ask the same sort of question about what is the right public rhetoric to defend something higher than preparation for vocation or career in a university without getting yourself into the Nietzschean trouble of elitism and exclusion. And just the realization that the vast majority of the world lives in such dire straits, suffering under so much of the burden of mere necessity, survival.
How can we
how can we even begin to have such a conversation about it? And that's why Nietzsche can seem so brutal, because in a way he enjoys simply saying that. Forget them. Because I think that's what he means by the horrible, frightening mask that we have to wear to get this point out, to make the point. It's not as if he thinks, here's my program. Ignore those people, forget about them. They're cows, they're herds. But this is what he meant. In order to inscribe eternal demands on the human heart, philosophy has to, for centuries, wear frightening, inhumane masks. And nobody takes that seriously when they go back to see the terrible things Nietzsche says about his indifference to anyone other than this elite. I think he's, in a way, just trying to grind our faces in it, that we don't know in an egalitarian secular culture, we don't know how to make this argument for nobility that isn't based on religion or idealism, which comes with a variety of philosophical assumptions that are no longer defensible.
You yourself have written about this recently, and you put it in terms of ultimately science versus value, the independence of value. You think that's also a Nietzschean theme that nowadays is being discussed among Nietzsche scholars? Is Nietzsche about the independence of value?
Yeah.
How do you connect that?
Depends on what you mean.
The last question, and then
depends on what you mean by independence, because as you know, the real attack on the autonomy of values comes from a kind of scientific natural interpretation of Nietzsche. That seems to be quite wrong. But to understand value apart from our psychological need for value, I think for Nietzsche would also be wrong. So I don't think by psychology he means a materialist, naturalist account of human motivation. I think he means to fold in the complex problem of interpretability in trying to understand why value appeals to us. We have to understand something about its appeal that isn't just its objective defensibility. So it's not independent of human psychology, but psychology for Nietzsche doesn't mean naturalistic drive theory kind of naturalism, which is in the Anglophone world the most popular sort of way of understanding. I think you get the same problem anybody would have with if you have a third person or sideways on view, you now understand the psychoneurological bases that lead people to value certain things and not value others. It's actually kind of useless in running one's own life. I mean, you can't.
That judgment that the husband defend that will be the end of it.
Yeah, well, they were my colleagues for a long, long time. So I hired them, actually. So back in San Diego, so I have a lot to answer for. But I don't think they have a sufficient answer at all, even the beginning of an answer to, given that this might be true, what difference does it make when I have to decide whom to marry, or whether to vote for this person or that person, or whether to give money to a charity, or I don't sit around and wait for my brain to decide. So this incompatibility between the third and the first person point of view, I think Nietzsche is very alive to it, and doesn't mean to reduce the first person to the third person. Because his question is Socrates' question: how to live. And all he does is introduce this massive historical dimension that Socrates didn't have. How to live now, in the face of the absence of the credibility of anything that informed the religious and philosophical tradition prior to the death of God. And they're really the first person to really say we have to imagine a completely different form of life. And then Wittgenstein and Heidegger would also try to address the same question. But that kind of question isn't a question that's answered by, well, I mean, we could try. What would be the form of life appropriate to the utopia of the churchlings? What would be the form of life? I mean, it looks like Clockwork Orange.
Robots, I don't know.
I think it looks like Clockwork Orange, you know. We'd have the guy with his eyes probably open and
Less violence, because then you're supposed to be able to mechanically control the drive towards violence and the enactment of violence. I really don't know.
Well, I don't think they have a view of how we would decide what we would put our new neurophysiological techniques to, how we would decide what it's before. They have no view of that, except a kind of utilitarian view of to increase human happiness. But as Nietzsche says, human beings don't want to be happy, only Englishmen want to be happy.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Many thanks.